Let me follow up with you, Vice President Biden. You've said you wouldn't meet with Kim Jong Un without preconditions. Are there any conditions under which you would meet with him?
On the condition that he would agree that he would be drawing down his nuclear capacity to get that the Korean Peninsula should be nuclear-free zone.
Hey folks, my name is John Lay and welcome back to the channel. Okay, so in a little over a week from now, the US is going to have the election day. And one way or another, we're going to find out who the next US president is going to be. Will Donald Trump be re-elected to serve another 4 years, or will he be voted out and be replaced by Joe Biden? Well, for this video, I'm going to focus on the possibility that Joe Biden becomes the next US president. And as you saw from the previous video clip, Joe Biden said that unless the North Korean government showed concrete signs that it was drawing down its nuclear forces, Joe Biden, if he wins the election, will not be meeting with Kim Jong Un. And so this video is going to be talking about why Joe Biden, if he wins the election, is not ever going to be meeting with Kim Jong Un then. Assuming, of course, that Joe Biden keeps his word. So over the past 4 years, a lot of stuff has been said about North Korea. Some people said that the North Koreans were serious about denuclearization, and Donald Trump said that North Korea was no longer a nuclear threat. But as we saw from the military parade that the North Koreans just had, and as they themselves have said many times, the North Koreans are never going to get rid of their nuclear weapons. And this video is going to explain why that is the case. Now, North Korea's nuclear weapons program can trace its beginnings all the way back to the 1990s. But that's just their weapons program. Their nuclear ambition goes back way before that. It goes all the way back to the days when Kim Il-sung was still a young man. Now, Kim Il-sung, if you're not sure who he is, was North Korea's first leader. And he wanted to get his hands on nuclear weapons, especially right after the way the Korean War turned out. His initial goal was to reunify the entire Korean peninsula under his rule. But when the United States came to South Korea's aid, the North Koreans were repelled and the Korean peninsula remains divided to this day. And now we have to think back to what things were like back in the 1950s and then up to the 1970s. Initially, back then, North Korea was much more powerful than South Korea was. Today, we know that South Korea is an economic powerhouse with an extremely powerful military. That wasn't always the case. From the 1950s to the 1970s, it was North Korea that was more powerful. But because South Korea was allied with the US and tens of thousands of American troops were stationed in South Korea, the North Koreans were not able to pursue their goal. Now, from the North Korean point of view, the fact that there were tens of thousands of American troops stationed in South Korea was scary enough. But that wasn't the only thing that they were scared of. And that's because starting in 1958, the United States started to deploy hundreds of nuclear weapons in South Korea. In fact, those nuclear weapons were stationed in South Korea all the way up to the end of the Cold War. Now, the fact that North Korea possesses several dozen nuclear weapons today is indeed a cause for concern. But let's be honest, it's not exactly something that normal people are really terrified of. And that's because we all know in the back of our minds that yes, nuclear weapons are terrifying, but if the North Koreans used a single nuclear weapon, that would be the end of their country. North Korea would be a radiated wasteland for thousands of years. So although North Korea is a de facto nuclear power, they really can't use any of their nuclear weapons. But if we transport ourselves all the way back to the 1950s and 60s, during the height of the Cold War, I'm sure that the North Koreans were just terrified of the American nuclear weapons that were stationed in South Korea. But starting in the 1980s, things just got from bad to worse for the North Koreans. Like as though it wasn't bad enough that they had to contend with an American allied South Korean government, that was also when the South Korean economy just started to outpace North Korea's economy. As the South Korean economy started to boom, the North Koreans started to get really nervous about this. Throughout the decades, the North and the South Koreans were constantly fighting against each other over the legitimacy. Both the North and the South Korean governments have their own constitutions, and each of their constitutions says that they are the legitimate government that represents the entire Korean peninsula. But starting in the 1980s, the South Korean economy started to grow larger, which meant that the military started to grow more powerful, and also, in 1988, the South Koreans hosted the Summer Olympics. After a certain point, the North Koreans realized that if a war broke out in the Korean peninsula, and assuming that the United States or China did not intervene in the war and it was just a war between the two Koreas, that they would not be able to defeat the South Koreans even on their own. When this realization dawned on them, the North Koreans understood that it was no longer sufficient to just dream about having nuclear weapons. And they understood that it was time to turn that dream into a reality. And that is how we ended up living in this world that we are living in right now. Now, North Korea's nuclear weapons program became public knowledge in the early 1990s, and we need to remember what North Korea was like back then. Starting in the early 1990s, when the Cold War came to an end, the North Korean economy started to really crumble. their economy had always been on very shaky ground, and they had lost the Soviet Union as their patron state. On top of that, the North Koreans experienced a severe drought, which led to an extreme famine. It is estimated that millions of North Koreans starved to death at the time. But even as millions of people were starving to death, even as the economy was crumbling, even as the rest of the world thought that it was only a matter of time before the North Korean regime collapsed, the North Koreans simply went full steam ahead with building their nuclear weapons program. Now, it's true that the fact that the North Koreans possess dozens of nuclear warheads has resulted in international sanctions against North Koreans. And yes, the North Koreans would love nothing more than to have these sanctions lifted. But we have to remember that the sacrifices that they went through to build these weapons in the first place was immense. Can you imagine what the reaction would be like in North Korea if Kim Jong Un one day decided to just say, alright, we don't need these nukes, we're going to get rid of them? Even before Kim Jong Un could get rid of the nuclear weapons, the North Korean people, the military, those people who are old enough to remember the arduous march, the days of droughts and famine, would be furious. The North Koreans believed that they went through all of that suffering so that they could gain these weapons, so that they could be a proud nation that could stand up to the United States. They would feel that their starvation, that their deaths, that their suffering would have all been for naught if Kim Jong Un decided to get rid of his nuclear weapons. So if Kim Jong Un one day decided to say that he genuinely wanted to get rid of his nuclear weapons, even if he actually meant that, the North Korean elites would not be happy with it. So as far as Kim Jong Un and the rest of the North Korean regime is concerned, denuclearization is pretty much the same thing as committing national suicide. But it's not been all bad for the North Koreans. Yes, they have to deal with international sanctions, but at least as far as the North Korean elites are concerned, these nuclear weapons have brought some concrete benefits. Now, it's true that the average North Korean person would prefer, say, food and electricity to having nuclear weapons, but as far as the regime is concerned, these nuclear weapons have produced a lot of tangible benefits. Over the years, the North Koreans have conducted numerous denuclearization talks. They've talked with South Korea, with the United States, and with Japan. And while they might have no intention to actually get rid of their nuclear weapons, they do have every intention to continue on with these talks. And that's because when they do have these talks, they get a lot of concessions. Concessions include, say, the opening of the Kaesong Industrial Complex and the Mount Kumgang tourism region, and they've also gotten a lot of food aid and medical aid, and they've also gotten a lot of economic concessions as well. Now imagine for a moment that the North Koreans don't actually have nuclear weapons. Sure, maybe South Korea would still be willing to negotiate with the North Koreans. After all, at least in public, the North Koreans and the South Koreans still say that they want reunification. But why would Japan and why would the United States bother to negotiate with North Korea? If the North Koreans did not possess nuclear weapons, the North Koreans would literally have nothing to negotiate with. They would have nothing in their cards. Now, in order to understand the final reason as to why the North Koreans will never abandon their nuclear weapons, we have to consider what the North Koreans' ultimate goal is. And that goal is not reunification, but rather it is regime survival. And in order to understand why they think that they absolutely need nuclear weapons to maintain their regime, we have to consider what happened to three other countries, and they're Iraq, Libya, and Ukraine. Now, as everyone is aware, back in 2003, the United States invaded Iraq with the pretext of getting rid of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. Now, while it turned out that the pretext for invading Iraq was completely based on a lie, the fact that Iraq did have a nuclear weapons program back in the day was not based on a lie. That was a historical fact. Firstly, Saddam Hussein had dreams of turning Iraq into a nuclear power. But that dream came to an end in 1981, and that's because the Israelis launched an airstrike against an Iraqi nuclear power plant. Now imagine if that airstrike had never happened. Imagine that Saddam Hussein did build nuclear weapons. How would the Middle East look today? I highly doubt that the United States would have went to war against Iraq twice if Saddam Hussein had actually acquired nuclear weapons. The second country that we have to talk about is Libya. Now, Libya also had a nuclear weapons program, but back in 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq, the Libyan leader, Muammar Gaddafi, was terrified that the same thing might happen to him, and so he voluntarily got rid of his nuclear weapons program. Now, Gaddafi's hope was that by getting rid of his nuclear weapons, he would be able to convince the West that he's no longer a threat and that they would leave him alone, that he would not have to face the same fate that Saddam Hussein faced. And for a while, the West did leave him alone. But then there came the Arab Spring, and when the Arab Spring started, Libya descended into a civil war. Now, things were already looking pretty bad enough for Muammar Gaddafi at this point, but this was when NATO decided to intervene in the war, and NATO sided with the anti-Gaddafi forces. And after that, let's just say that things didn't go well for Gaddafi at all. The third country that we have to talk about is Ukraine. Now, back during the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union deployed nuclear weapons in Ukraine. But after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the nuclear weapons were still there. And so, in 1994, Ukraine and several other governments got together to sign the Budapest Memorandum of Security Assurances. What the agreement stated was that in exchange for getting rid of the nuclear weapons, in exchange for joining the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, Ukraine and several other countries would get rid of their nuclear weapons. But in exchange, those other governments, which included Russia, the United States, and Great Britain, would recognize and respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. But in 2014, Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula, which definitely violated Ukraine's territorial integrity. And naturally, this caused a lot of bitter feelings in Ukraine. They were supposed to have the territorial integrity recognized and respected, but that agreement just went down the toilet. So if we put ourselves in North Korea's shoes, and if we look at what happened in Iraq, and in Libya, and in Ukraine, why would the North Koreans ever want to get rid of their nuclear weapons? Getting rid of the nuclear weapons would be a surefire way for them to be attacked, for them to be undermined. And that is why the North Koreans will never get rid of their nuclear weapons. And that would mean that if Joe Biden keeps his word, he will not ever be meeting with Kim Jong Un. But does this mean that there will be no diplomacy between North Korea and the United States? No, not at all. Just because the two leaders will be meeting personally doesn't mean that there will be no diplomacy between the two governments. Now, Donald Trump honestly seems to believe that he alone can fix things. That by meeting in a room with Kim Jong Un alone, the two of them can just hash things out and end the nuclear crisis and bring about permanent peace in the Korean Peninsula. Unsurprisingly, Donald Trump was wrong. Now, if Joe Biden becomes the next American president, he will pursue a much more traditional foreign policy with a functioning State Department, which means that there will be career diplomats and bureaucrats who will be engaged in on-the-ground negotiations without any of the pomp and the fanfare of leadership summits. So, just because the two leaders will not be meeting in person doesn't mean that there will be no diplomacy between the United States and North Korea. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this video. If you like this video, don't forget to click on the like, subscribe, and the notification bell. And if you have a comment, feel free to leave it down below. My name is John Lay, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.